Hello everyone, it's Juliana Michaels and welcome to my channel. In this video I'm sharing one of my favorite techniques using some of the newly released dies from the timholtz Sizzix March release. And the best part is you don't need an embossing folder to do it. I'm going to show you how to create a rich textured background using die cuts you already own, plus distress sprays and Foundry wax for color and shine. It's a faux embossing technique that works with any dies in your stash and the results are stunning. Now let's get into it. To create the background for this card, which is the main focus of this video, I'm going to be using the new timholtz Sizzix Vault World Travel die set. So I'm going to be using this globe piece here. And the embellishments, I will be using that same die, but also the handwritten journey die set, the tailored die set, and the Alphanumeric Bulletin die set. As always, feel free to use whatever other dies you have in your stash and play along with a similar technique. For the mediums on the background of the paper, I'm going to be working with some distress spray stains in Uncharted Mariner and Broken China. And then I've got Uncharted Mariner and Weathered Wood in the Distress Oxide sprays. You don't need both kinds of sprays to play along. You could have one or the other, but if you do have both, it is fun to combine them and enjoy the process of the unique effects you get when they are combined together. Now, I'm also going to be working with the Distress Foundry wax in mind, and then with that you're going to need some isopropyl rubbing alcohol. I would recommend 90%, and then also some Distress ink and ground espresso. And then for the embellishments on the card, I'm going to be using some Distress ink in peeled paint and Uncharted Mariner, and then also the ground espresso. These could be substituted with Distress Oxide inks or any other kind of blending ink that you might have, and whatever colors you want to use as well. Any of these can be switched out. If you don't have the Foundry wax, you could also use like a copper colored or metallic colored acrylic paint to create the splatters, because that's what we're going to use this for. So definitely some options of different things that you can use to play along. And then for the background on the card, I'm going to be using Distress Kraft stock, which is just a slightly heavier duty craft paper that can handle wet mediums. So it's not quite the same as like a watercolor paper that can handle even more, but it can handle quite a bit. So that's what I'm going to be working with. So if you don't have this, you could do these same techniques using watercolor cardstock or any other kind of mixed media type paper that can handle wet mediums such as the sprays. And then for the embellishments on the card, I'm going to be working with Distress watercolor cardstock, some black Kraft stock, and some kind of copper colored metallic Kraft stock. So any kind of blendable white cardstock will work. So if there's other kind of cardstock that you like to do with ink blending, you can use that. As far as the black Kraft stock, you could just use regular black cardstock. You can also take Kraft paper and paint it with acrylic paint. I have a video where I show you how to do that and kind of make your own colored Kraft stock. And then of course, any kind of metallic paper will work too. Before I begin the die cutting, just wanted to go over a little bit here with this die. There is an outline die that cuts the circle out, and then there is the die that cuts out the globe shape. And the reason being is that just gives you some options if you wanted to create like shaker cards or window type designs with this element, but you can also cut them all together. And I like to kind of help hold those pieces together using just like some mint tape. You could also use washi tape. So you can just kind of eyeball getting that centered together, and then just use a little tape to hold them together so that they don't slide around when you do your die cutting. And then I'm cutting this from a piece of Kraft stock, which is a little bit thicker cardstock, and I'm going to just cut that down around the shape of the die, just so I'm not wasting so much paper. And now I'm going to run that through my die cutting machine here. And this die is somewhat detailed, especially here in this upper corner and with some of these lines. So I just find the chrome precision plate, which is what this is here, to be really helpful when die cutting these kind of dies. And so then you can just, pop that out. Now you probably will notice like the tape will tear, so you may have to just reline it each time and just add some more tape. And then you can just remove that piece that's torn or cut through, and then just repeat that process. Now when it comes to sometimes getting this tape off, sometimes I find like a metal palette knife works really well to kind of get underneath there and peel that off, because the pressure will cause that tape to really stick to that metal sometimes. So you're just going to continue die cutting until you have 4 of the globes, and then you are ready to move on to the next step. Now you might notice that all these dies still have the little bits and pieces in there, and what I like to do is work with the thicker foam pad that's made for like embossing with the flowers, and then take the little really pokey tool here and just rub over the surface to get those, at least as many of those little pieces out of there as I can. And then I can take my pokey tool and just poke out any other ones that aren't coming out right away. And then I'll just repeat that process with the rest of my dies. Next, what we're going to do is take another piece of the Kraft stock paper that I've cut down mine to 4 by 5¼ inches. So if you are working with a larger card, you might need more than just these 4 die cuts. But then we're just going to take a liquid adhesive. I like using one with like this super fine tip, and we're going to apply liquid glue to as much of this as we can. So you're just going to kind of take your time. This part is a little bit time consuming, and I realize that, but just enjoy the process. No need to stress out over it. And just get glue. It doesn't have to be on every little piece. You can kind of fix that later on if you need to add more adhesive. Okay. And then I'm going to put this first one so that almost all of the globe is on the paper, and kind of in like the center, but off to the side here just a little bit. We can press that down. And then I like to take a clean paper towel and just kind of dab off any excess glue. And then if you want, you can just set like a acrylic block on top of there for a few seconds to just let that dry. But you just want to dab up any glue that's a lot of excess glue that's, if any of that is kind of seeped out underneath the die cut. And different glues are going to do differently with this, so some of them kind of absorb inks and things better than others. I personally am really enjoying this Barely Art glue. This is new to me, and I'm just finding it to be a really nice glue. It dries clear, which is something that I really, really like in a liquid adhesive. And then this really delicate little tip is helpful as well. So next, we're going to glue this next layer on, and I am going to kind of add it down here to the bottom and butt it up against this other die cut, and then again just kind of push that down, dab up any excess glue that soaks out. And then again, if you want to, you know, set your acrylic block on there and let that dry for a minute or so, you can. And then we're going to take another die cut and just kind of repeat that process here in another corner. And here I'm just going to kind of butt it in this direction. And as I'm adding these, I'm trying to kind of rotate so that the globe is like facing different directions each way you go with it. That kind of just adds a little bit of interest as well. For this one, I'm going to really rotate it sideways so you can kind of, you know, as you're thinking about where you're going to add your next piece, you can kind of think about that, and then that gives you some guidelines on where you want to put the adhesive so that it's sticking on there good. And again, remember just your butt kind of butting it up against those other die cuts, so you'll have these little spaces in between, but they're all touching and connected. And then again, just kind of going in there and wiping up any of that excess glue. Now at this point, I would wait and make sure that these are all adhered really well before we go on to the next step here, because the next thing we're going to do is trim off this excess. So you can kind of dab off some of that glue to help speed up that process, because you don't need it at this point. And then you can just, you know, make sure everything's glued down well, and then give that time to dry for a few minutes. And then once that glue is dry, you can just take a pair of scissors. I like working with like a longer pair of scissors when I'm doing this sort of die cut and trimming. And then I like to flip it over, and then I can use this edge of the background kind of as a guide with my scissors on where to cut. And I just trim along the edge of the paper there. And then you're going to save these, because we're going to use these to fill in these open sections here. So we'll have one that we can put there, and then we can fill in these other sections, other little pieces here. So we'll glue this one down next. And if you find that how you placed yours on here, you don't have, you know, your pieces that you cut off aren't big enough, you can always just cut another die cut, and then you'll have plenty to work with. But you can see in this little corner, you really don't need much at all to fill that in. And then over here, same thing, you've got plenty, you've got plenty of die cut there to add that one in as well. So let's glue that one on. Just remember, butt it up against those other die cuts, and then dab off the excess. Add a little bit to this one here, and get that one glued down. And again, just want to wait and let this layer dry. Dab off that excess glue on the back side if you want. And then once that's dry, then again, you can just take those scissors, cut along the back side there, and trim off the excess. And then at this point, you might want to just kind of go around the edges, and if you've got some pieces that don't have any glue on them, just grab your adhesive and just kind of dab a little bit onto those sections. Again, remembering to kind of dab off any of that excess, because the glue can act as a little bit of a resist. So, the next layer that we're going to add on this might not adhere as well if you've got a lot of glue sticking up. So I think that's pretty good. And you might find some pieces as you go along with this, and you can always add glue later if you need to. All right, so that's where we are. And that's, you know, you can just leave it as this and move on to, you know, embellishing the card and just use this as your background. It really, in my mind, kind of creates this super cool like faux embossed effect with the die cuts layered, especially when you're using all the same color or the same kind of paper. It really, really lends to that faux embossed effect and gives you one more way to use your die cuts. So for the next step, we're going to play around with some spray inks, and I've got some distress sprays and some distress oxides here. And the distress spray stains I've got is Broken China and Uncharted Mariner, and then I've got Uncharted Mariner and Iced Spruce in the oxide sprays. And before you work with the oxides, just make sure you shake these up really well and get all that pigment mixed in the bottom. So I am going to start off with the lighter of my spray stains. And again, if you remember from my previous video, I kind of talked about layering spray stains and oxides. And you always want to start off with the spray stains because the oxides have pigment in them. So they're going to be more opaque, where the spray stains are a little more translucent. So you can't really add spray stain over the oxides, but you can do the oxides over the spray stains. And then that said, you can also, you know, while they're wet, they're going to blend with each other. So just gives you some options there. So I'm just spraying some of that Broken China on. Now we'll add a little bit of the Uncharted Mariner. And if you don't have all of these different sprays, you just have just the spray stains or you have just the oxides, you can do either or. You don't have to use both. And now I'm going to add a little bit of the Uncharted Mariner. And you can see how that kind of takes over a little bit more and starts covering that background a little bit more. And now I'm just going to use my distress sprayer and kind of hold it at a little bit of an angle here. Just add a little bit of water to this to just kind of get that ink flowing a little bit here and there. And I am going to go back and add a little bit more of the Uncharted Mariner spray stain. And I'm kind of going for the areas that don't have, oh, that's the oxide spray. That's all right. I'm going to go back into the areas that don't really have any oxide spray on them. Just holding it a little bit closer because I want to get a little more intense coverage there. And now, last but not least, I'm going to add a little weathered wood. And I'm going to hold this one back a little bit farther and kind of try to go a little slower spritzing so I can get more like little speckles of the spray. You can also take the nozzle off and add some splatters. And then from here, I am going to start drying this. If you want to add a little more water to it, you can, to kind of get those colors flowing a little bit more. And if you got little puddles developing because you've got a lot of ink on there, just you can lift it up and tap it off and just kind of rotate it around to get that ink moving. And then as you're drying, kind of helps if you can pick it up and you know, drying it on the flat surface here, it'll just take a little bit longer. If the air can kind of get underneath it and around it, it's going to dry a little faster. But you can also set this to the side and let it dry on its own too. You don't have to use a heat tool unless you just want to speed up the process, which for me is always the case. I'm usually pretty impatient when it comes to waiting for things to dry. Now, as you're adding the spray inks, if you notice some sections that are kind of popping up because maybe you didn't get enough adhesive underneath there, you can always go back and add some. Just take the tip, especially if you've got one of those fine tip bottles, you can just kind of stick it underneath there and give it a little squirt if you need to. And then from here, I think I am going to go back and I'm going to add a little bit more of the iced spruce splatters. Just kind of tap here and there for that. And give that a little dry. And I'm also going to add some splatters now with my distress sprayer, which is just water. And I'm going to pull the trigger kind of nice and slow and back from the paper at a little bit of an angle. So just kind of slow, so I'm just getting these little droplets. One little light mist there. Then if you want to create some interest here, you can take your paper towel and lift off some of that ink. Because even though it's dry, because it's water reactive, it's always going to react when you add water to it. So you can kind of just use that to lift off some of that ink and just creates another level of interest to the background there. And there we are with our sprayed background now. So again, you can stop at this point if you like, but I'm going to add one more layer to mine with some splatters, and I'm going to use the Distress Foundry wax for this. And the color I'm working with here is Mind, and I also have some 90% isopropyl rubbing alcohol and a splatter brush here. And again, with the Foundry wax, it's got a little shaker ball in there. You just want to make sure you shake this up really well and get that pigment mixed in before you start using it. And I'm just going to add a little drop of that to my craft mat here. Doesn't take much. Wipe off the tip there. And then we're just going to add a small little drop of the rubbing alcohol. And then you can use your brush just to kind of mix those together. And then from there, just going to pick that up and then just add the splatters to your craft mat, or to your project. So if you need a little bit more, sometimes you can add a little bit more of the isopropyl alcohol. Get some more splatters, but if you need more of the Foundry wax, just add a little more Foundry wax to your craft mat and repeat that process. Now with the Foundry wax, it is not permanent unless it is heated. So at this point, you know, you kind of have, you can see the splatters we added, but they'll wipe off even when they're dry. You have to heat these with the heat tool. So just take your heat tool, let it get warmed up, and it's kind of like when you're heat embossing, you're just gonna heat this wax up until it starts changing and goes from dull to shiny. And once it becomes shiny, it is permanent. And it is really hard for me to capture this on film because the camera wants to focus on my heat gun because that is closer to it than the paper. Once everything is shiny, you can just kind of maybe run over it one more time just to make sure you got all of the areas. And then here, kind of tilt that a little bit, and you can see those splatters now show up a lot better. And just adds another wonderful touch to the background there. And then, as I mentioned, so now that wax is permanent, so you don't have to worry about this wiping off or anything unless you just missed a spot where you didn't get it heat set. As for what's on your craft mat, it just turns into a powder when it's not heat set, so you can just wipe that off. lot of times I will just take a little bit of rubbing alcohol and clean it off my craft mat, and then you can clean your brush off real easy as well. You can use a little bit of water to kind of get that pigment out of there. But if you're wondering if you can use water to make the splatters, I have not found that to be successful. I found the rubbing alcohol to be the best medium to add to create the splatters. And then the final touch, I'm just going to ink the edges here with a blending brush and some ground espresso. Now, a lot of times I like to kind of do that circular motion thing, but you'll notice that might not be the best idea with these little delicate die cut pieces on here. So if you try that, you might find that you've got more pieces that need to be glued down. So another option is just to take the brush and kind of apply the ink in the kind of direction of the paper here so that it's less likely to rip or tear something off. And then you can just work your way around the paper. And there you have it. So there is a look at our finished background. And then from here, you can just mat this onto another layer of cardstock or however you want. If you wanted this just to be the background, you don't want to mat this, I would make this paper a little bit bigger, but whatever size you want it for your finished card is fine. And then from there, we just add the embellishments. So to create the focal point on this card, I used a variety of Tim Holtz dies. One of them is this Handwritten Journey die set. And I use this word journey here and just die cut that from some kind of copper colored metallic paper. I also cut it a couple times from Kraft stock and then glued those 3 layers together just to make this less delicate because these die cuts are super tiny and just makes it a little bit easier to adhere things. And I did that same thing with this little airplane, which is from the Vault Travel die set. And then for the word soul, I used the Alphanumeric Bulletin, and I cut that from some distress watercolor cardstock and ink blended that with some peeled paint distress ink. And then I just glued the layers down onto the background and then just layered on these other die cuts. Now the full sentiment here, the journey awakens the soul, I used my vintage typewriter to type out the pieces that you see here, these little strips, and just printed those out, or just typed those out onto some white cardstock and inked the edges with the ground espresso ink and then adhered them to the card using a little bit of foam adhesive. And then for the hat and the top coat here, I used the tailored die set, which is one of my favorites. And I just die cut the layers from some black Kraft stock and some distressed watercolor cardstock and some white. Actually, for the shirt layer, I use a thicker, heavier quality printer typing paper. And that's also what I used for these sentiments here because it kind of goes through my typewriter easier. But then on this, it folds easier to make the little shirt piece than trying to use regular cardstock. And then I just used some distress ink in Uncharted Mariner to ink up the bow tie and the band on the hat. And then with all of these die cuts, I used a Ranger sanding disc, which is just a fine grit sandpaper, and I rubbed over the paper a little bit to reveal the core of the paper. So with this paper, it's got a Kraft core, and so that's where you can kind of see that Kraft paper peeking underneath there. And with this paper, it was white, and then I added the Uncharted Mariner color. So when I sanded over it, then you kind of get that white popping through a little bit. And then I just adhered those to the card with a little bit of foam adhesive, just to add a little bit of dimension. And There you have it. I hope you enjoyed this faux embossing technique and feel inspired to try it with dies you already have in your stash. Remember, you don't need an embossing folder to create a rich, textured background. Just grab some die cuts, some distress sprays, and you're good to go. You can find links to all of the products I used in the description box below, along with a visual supply list for quick reference. If you enjoyed this tutorial, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more creative ideas. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you have dies in your stash you've been sleeping on that this technique might work for? Until next time, stay crafty, my friend.